Well, tonight we'll be continuing part 3 of our little series on biblical principles for society and government, and we're doing a second week specifically about women and marriage. Mostly, we've been kind of focusing essentially on the Torah and the Old Testament and things like that, and deriving general principles from there, and we're going to go more into the New Testament, but it's still going to be set in that context. And I said that throughout this series, I believe it is important that Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27 creates that overarching principle, I think, which should supervene everything we read and understand. It should supervene everything, even when we read what seem maybe at first sight to be some rather harsh rules sometimes in the Old Testament, in the Torah. And remember, I said that we are not, in case you were unaware of it, we are not ancient Israel. We are not a theocracy. We are not required to follow these rules, but nevertheless, they show us something about the heart of God. They tell us about who God is. They tell us what He wants to see in people. We learn about His attributes by studying His law. It is more, there's an old phrase that I think was, I don't remember who coined it or if anybody knows, but when speaking of the Old and the New Testaments, it is the New Testament is in the Old concealed, the Old is in the New revealed. They don't work at odds with each other. It's one continuous story, it's one continuous theme. And so as a matter of background, we mentioned in week one that throughout the series, Genesis 1, 26 through 27 is the principle that I'm hoping that we can see everything through light of. That's, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in His own image, and in the image of God created He him, male and female created He them. And this guiding principle should we should have that in the back of our mind whenever we think about any major issue society comes across, whether it be eugenics, whether it be abortion, whether it be slavery, whether it be how you treat the weak and or the infirm, how you treat women, how you treat criminals, etc., how you treat everybody. The human dignity that they have as being God's image bearer should be a key thing that we keep in mind. In other words, one of the things I want us to do, and this is where I believe scoffers go wrong, and some of you may have run into them. There are those who are usually rather ignorant about what the Old Testament, the Torah, is really teaching, who suggest, so there's some apologetic value, I hope, to what we're going through here in these few weeks. There's the suggestion that in the Old Testament that God is teaching a backwards, patriarchal, unenlightened, harsh and cruel civilization, and our morality is so much more enlightened now that frankly the Old Testament, we can't derive anything after that. After all, the Bible permits slavery. It absolutely does not. We'll get into that presumably next Sunday evening. But it absolutely did not. Very clearly it did not. That women were treated as chattel, as property. That is not the case. I suggested in week 1 that the Old Testament, compared to the rest of the ancient Near East, the Old Testament Torah, the laws implied there, were practically radically progressive given their given the neighbors and the world around them. In other words, when we come across these things, even if they're harsh, we want to read them charitably. We want to see that there's probably a good reason God is doing something. He is reacting and giving a law. Laws are not given to perfect people who always do the right thing. If humanity were perfect, if mankind were perfect, if there were no sin in the world, there would be no law enforcement. There would be no laws. There would be no rules. You wouldn't need rules. In the garden, all God had to say was just don't eat of that. No other rules. Because there was nothing else to worry about. Rules and laws, even if they may seem harsh, need to be put in the context of the Old Testament, the ancient Near East where they were, and they need to be understood that they are usually laws respecting sinful humanity, God essentially giving laws so society could do as well as it could for sinful people. And we mentioned last week, and if you haven't, and I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but we went to two basic, not last week, week before last, but we looked at two Old Testament passages respecting women in marriage and some of the rules it gave. The first one was in Exodus chapter 21, verse 7 through 11. I'll read it. If a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. So a man in payment of a debt he serves for 7 years. When he is finished paying off that debt, or the year of Jubilee, after that time, he goes free. Here the situation is somebody is in debt, somebody who has a daughter, somebody who has to care for her, is out of money, cannot pay a debt, and he looks to find the best situation, the best appointment he can find for her, okay? So he says, hey, I don't have the money to repay. I need somebody to care for my daughter anyways. How about I betroth her to you or possibly to your son? That's the best situation he can find for her. She can't just simply appeal to, welfare or anything else like that. So it says she won't go out because she's presumably, the assumption is she's going to be betrothed. If she please not her master, who's betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed, bought back. To sell her unto a strange nation he shall have no power. So she is not cattle, she has rights. He cannot just give her away any old place. She's not a slave, she's not property. He cannot sell her to a non-Jew, seeing he has dealt deceitfully with her. He's been dishonest. And if he has betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And we mentioned that. We know that the ancient Hebrew practice, and the practice all the way up until, well, frankly, the diaspora, was that the very minimum, even the lowest form of wife was guaranteed, was adequate food, adequate clothing, shelter, and duty of marriage. He cannot, no matter what, no matter how bad he wants to, rob her of those things. And it reads, if he do not these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money. So these are the basic minimums that all wives, even the lowliest wives, are required to have. That was how it was enforced. That was how it was viewed. Those statements would be on marriage certificates. We mentioned the week before last that family documents, specifically marriage certificates and divorce certificates, and we'll review that really quickly, that divorce certificates were critically important documents. And that when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through 4, the Mosaic rules respecting divorce, that was God, this is what I'm insisting, that was God looking out for women, looking out for them. Not that God desired divorce, and Jesus is going to speak to that in the New Testament, but that it was a protection for them. So these three things, her food, her raiment, clothing, shelter, the basics of life, and duty of marriage, the possibility of having children, etc. He cannot just completely defraud her and ignore her. Okay? Even if he wants to, she must be taken care of. In Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, we have the somewhat infamous divorce statements. And I suggested that the point of that is really that the divorce certificate was not Moses saying, hey, it's great, let's throw away our wives whenever we get tired of them, but that the divorce certificate was a radically important protection for women in that day and age. That passage reads in verse 1 through 4, when a man has taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass. Remember, this is not a perfect situation. Moses is not saying this is a good thing. Jesus is going to talk about this, and he's going to say, because of your hardness of your hearts, you did that. But when a man has taken a wife and married her, and it comes to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her. That's an important set of statements we'll pick apart, some uncleanness. Then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. When she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her and write her a bill of divorcement and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband which sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. After that, she's defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. Thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. Now, the focus here that we want to look at is, why is it important that she be given this divorce certificate? The reality is, the divorce certificate, and we have copies of those. Archaeology has unearthed marriage and divorce certificates. I mentioned that on marriage certificates, Exodus chapter 21, that passage is usually written on that marriage certificate, or at least the minimum statements that she must be always given her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage, and that on divorce certificates, there always must be specific writing as well. That writing is divorced from so-and-so who may not take her again, and that she is free to marry another, that is to say, any legitimate Jew. What does that do for her? Let's face it, there were not a lot of careers available for women in that day and age. There weren't a lot of ways that she could take care of herself. Her parents, her father, her family, and or her husband and children are her security. The divorce certificate meant that that man was free of all claims of hers, and I suggested two possible reasons. Now, they don't contradict each other, but for what we know, two possible reasons why the statement that her former husband cannot take her again. Okay. And we look at that and we think, well, that might be an ideal situation. I mean, if there's a broken home, there's a divorce, it's an illegitimate divorce or something, why couldn't, if she's no longer married, the first husband take her back? We would look at that as reconciliation. And that would be a good thing. But here it's being practiced in a wicked world. And the best research I could came up, two explanations. They may both be true, there may be more, is one of them is that what could be occurring why the former husband cannot take her again is he might be seeking extra dowry, bride prices if they had no children, but she marries somebody else. Now she has children. He can't just say, oh, by the way, she's my wife. He can't arbitrarily reclaim her. Everyone knows that she's married to so-and-so. He can't get rid of her when he feels like it. And then when she finally finds some other situation, can't say, hey, that's my wife, and I've got a claim on her now that she's got dowry, maybe now that she has children, maybe now that she has property, etc. One of them could be those reasons. Also, it could be, if that was practiced in the ancient Near East, we know it is now to this day, possibly to prevent things such as the pleasure marriages, the nikamutas, and things like that, which is the situation practiced by, I know, Shiite Muslims to this day, where people would basically have a marriage ceremony. It's probably wrapped in the hospitality culture of the ancient Near East and the modern Near East, quite frankly. But wrapped into that hospitality is the idea that you can simply take a woman, you have a guest, you give him not only the best of everything, the best food, the best protection, the best all, etc., but hey, why not a wife as well? And they will, and they actually do it sometimes. And I'm not saying this just to trash them, but it is a reality. They'll admit it to you. They will actually have marriage ceremonies where you have a temporary wife, and then they can just turn around when they're finished and say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And if a man truly loves his wife, this would render that situation impossible, is what I'm saying. Women cannot be treated that way. If she's your wife, you can't basically, treat her like that. That's treating them essentially that's treating them like prostitutes, quite frankly, and that is sometimes done. Israel's neighbors were wicked. This kind of and I'm not, I cannot prove that that's what Moses was looking at, but those are some of the best scholarly explanations I could find. There could be more. But this would prevent that type of situation, both of those. Okay. But now let's look at Matthew chapter 19, and we'll get Jesus involved in giving us some of the explanations of what's going on. A familiar passage, but one that refers very distinctly back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through 4, and Exodus chapter 21. Matthew chapter 19. Some people confront Jesus about the laws of divorce in Deuteronomy chapter 24, or the rules. And we find that that of course, it was being abused the way it was written, even though it was clearly understood. Hilariously so, in fact. Matthew chapter 19, let's look at verses 3 through 9. And the Pharisees also came, verse 3 of Matthew chapter 19. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him and saying unto him, that's Jesus, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And they said unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? And he said unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication and adultery, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her that is put away, doth commit adultery. Okay, so those need to be read and understood quite closely, because there is some key verbiage in that is being addressed that the people that are asking about are very familiar with, that it helps us to have a little historical background about. Now, we know that Jesus was often, some of the reasons they came to him is they were just trying to trap him, just to tempt him, trying to trap him into saying something foolish or stupid. People were, usually when Pharisees or scribes or lawyers come to Jesus and ask him a question, they are not seeking spiritual truth. They're seeking to trap him up or do something else. Well, here, there's at least two, or were at the time, two factions we are aware of that had two different opposing understandings of Deuteronomy chapter 24, the divorce clause. And they want Jesus to settle a dispute. And there's essentially two schools. There's the school of Hillel on this topic and the school of Shammai. So when you get a divorce, it is very important what lawyer you choose and which school they're from to make sure that they are representing your cause correctly. The school of Shammai was the conservative one for all intents and purposes, the one that was more accurate, that said divorce was only justified for the causes of adultery. You can't just put away your wife for any reason whatsoever. Adultery, as Jesus says here, except for the cause of fornication. But you'll notice he's not playing into their hands. They want to solve a theological debate, that's true, but they want more than that. And he's not going to say, okay, you guys are right, you guys are wrong. He doesn't play the game they want him to play it. So, the school of Shammai is in that sense correct. The school of Hillel now, they minced words. There's two words being used in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. If you'll notice in Matthew here, it says for every cause. What are they asking him? They're asking him, is it okay to divorce your wife for any reason whatsoever that we can possibly feel like any reason we want to? Not just adultery, but for any reason whatsoever. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just because there is a learned theologian, I assure you that men's evil, wicked desires do affect what they believe and what they study and what they'll teach, because the school of Hillel here, the liberal school, had an absolutely absurd doctrine. If you go back to Deuteronomy, and you don't have to look at it, but these words, when a man has taken a wife and married her, and it comes to pass that she find no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness. Those two words are taken apart, and the school of Hillel said, aha, we have two things here. We have uncleanness, adultery, that's the word erva, and we have the word devar. And if any of you have any Hebrew training, the word devar can mean practically anything. It must have a context. So they say there's two words here. There's adultery, obviously. We grant that. But what's devar? Well, it translates speech. When I studied it, was word, matter, or thing. But it's not very narrow. It basically means speech, word, a speaking, a clause perhaps, a thing, a saying, an utterance, word, words, a business, occupation, an act, a matter, a cause, a case, or something by extension. That's the kind of duty the word devar does. It's very inexplicit. So the school of Hillel said, hey, we've got erva, we've got adultery, and we've got a thing. She burns dinner, that's a thing. We have devar, right? She gains 10 pounds, that's a thing. We have a thing here. So didn't Moses say that, well, of course, for adultery, now we can divorce our wives. But not only that, we have, a thing, something. Maybe she burns dinner. And their teaching then was, well, any reason at all. And so they're wanting to settle that dispute. This is how absurd, ladies and gentlemen, people can be. If you think about the context of it, why in the world would God suggest that it was abominable, that it was inherently sinful, and that God would say anything like adultery or, well, just anything? Now, that is absurd. And these people aren't stupid. We're not stupid when we believe foolish things out of the scriptures or we convince ourselves of foolish and strange doctrines. What we are is wicked. They're reading into that passage exactly what they want. They know better. Hebrew was the tongue they were born with. They know what the word devar means. They're not stupid. They are self-deceived. This is willful ignorance. Nobody using their right mind would read that passage and think it's adultery or, well, just a thing. A thing. But the excuse they've used is there's two words. There's devar, a thing, a matter, a something, and, of course, adultery. That is absurd. They knew better, but we're not much better a lot of times. That's what they want to say. And, of course, the word erva is something like nakedness, shame, nakedness of a thing, indecency, improper behavior, i.e. adultery. Jesus here says fornication, exposure, okay? That was the one legitimate grounds for divorce, not just also, well, anything. In other words, you cannot find no-fault divorce in the scriptures anywhere. If our society wants to model our society after the biblical model at all, no-fault divorce is not a thing. That is a heretical liberal school that is making up the most absurd reasons to believe whatever they feel like. There's no such thing as no-fault divorce. But this is what they were teaching. So Jesus doesn't really play into their hands because he decides that he's going to take it his own way. And he doesn't really say, now let's debate the words and the verbiage here. He does something here. I like it. And this is why I think it's legitimate to look at Genesis chapter 1, to go back to the beginning. If the foundation isn't there, if we don't go back to the beginning, there's something in theology and hermeneutics called the law of first mention. The word law is probably not a good one to use because it's not like a universal stamped truth, but it's a general principle that the first time chronologically in the salvific history of mankind, in the progressive revealing of God's will towards man, the first time an idea or a notion is mentioned or taught, it's good to go back to that original time and place. It's good to go. In other words, everything subsequent to it is built on that as a foundation. Which is why I believe that the idea that man is built in God's image is a good foundation for everything we're going to read from the Torah. Jesus doesn't say, hey, let's go to Deuteronomy and debate meaningless strifes of words. Let's go right back to Genesis, and let me tell you what God's real intent was, because frankly, both of you guys are getting it wrong. So he tells them a bunch of things that they don't really want to hear at all, because he throws in things that they weren't asking about. They said, Jesus responds and he says to them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he says, for this cause shall a man leave his father and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Now, you might be the good group of Shammai, and you may be teaching good conservative principles in that application where you're teaching that only adultery is a proper reason for divorce, but you might also be an apologist for polygamy. And Jesus is condemning that here in this passage as well. Search where you will. If you read very closely in verse 5, it says, and they two, or twain in the KJV, they two shall be one flesh. In no Hebrew manuscript ever in any of the originals, go back to Genesis, does it say they two? Okay. It just says they shall be one flesh. Jesus inserts essentially the word two there. He didn't do it unjustifiably. The Septuagint reads that way. Every Greek manuscript reads that way. Aramaic translations, the Peshitta, all added the word two there because they knew full well that polygamy was being practiced. And so where Genesis would say, they shall be one flesh, talking about one male and one female, they added but it is an addition. It's not in the original Hebrew, at least any manuscript we can find. It's not in Genesis 1 if you read it now. It doesn't say they two shall be one flesh. It just says they shall be one flesh. Jesus makes sure he condemns polygamy on the side. Be careful if you actually search the scriptures, ladies and gentlemen, to settle a theological debate because you might learn things that you don't want to learn. You're not just going to win an argument. You might also find that you're wrong about other things and you ought to change other aspects of your life. And these guys are going to get way more than they bargained for. Jesus says, yeah, it's true. Adultery is the only fair reason for divorce. But two things. First of all, you're both sinful when it comes to the polygamy practice. That's wrong. He points that out. Also, he corrects their verbiage. The Pharisees and others come tempting. Verse 3 says, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? I'm sorry. Verse 7, they said unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? Now, the command is, if you do this in this situation, if you are wicked and unholy, if you do something wrong, you must give a writing of divorcement. That's the only command portion of it. It's never a command to divorce. But they said, why then did Moses command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? He didn't command them to put her away. What the command was, if you are going to, since I know you're wicked and hard-hearted, you must give her a writing of divorcement as a protection for her, as we mentioned the other week. Jesus responds and says, Moses, verse 8, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you, not commanded you, he suffered you to give her a bill of divorcement. But this was not the plan. Ladies and gentlemen, because there is adultery even, that may be a biblically justified reason for divorce. I agree that it is. I do believe that adultery is, well, essentially the only, perhaps some other things. But minimum, we can pretty much all agree that adultery is a legitimate reason biblically for divorce. It's not ideal. Ideally, there is restoration. Ideally, there is healing. Ideally, there is forgiveness. And Jesus, I think, is going to, ideally, there's reconciliation. There's no commandment to divorce just because there's adultery. And these guys are saying, well, hey, didn't Moses command us to use an adultery? So what is that going to do? That's going to cause false accusations of adultery if a man wants to get rid of his wife. And there are protections against that as well, or it could at least. He could claim that there's adultery, but it's unprovable, even though there's not. But there's a thing, a devar, a matter, a cause, a thing, a something. She burns dinner, etc. She doesn't have children or whatever, and he wants to get rid of his wife, so he might falsely accuse her of adultery. But that's not a command. It wasn't a command. The command was only to give her that protection. But Jesus goes right back to Genesis chapter 2. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and they two shall mean one flesh, shall be one flesh. So he takes the time to go ahead and say, no, guys, go back to the beginning. Go back to the foundation. Go back to the book of Genesis and see what I'm really looking for. Go back to, see, this is before sin entered the world. That's why Jesus is appealing to Genesis, because he's going back, I believe, to before the fall. Genesis chapter 2, where Jesus is citing, is before the fall. All these other laws are for an imperfect world, for imperfect people. And Jesus said, for the hardness of your hearts, that's extremely strong verbiage. He says, because of the hardness of your hearts, sclerocardia, you may be able to atherosclerosis, hardening of arteries, for instance, cardio, heart, sclerocardia. He says, because of hardness of your hearts. And I want to give you a brief example of how that word is used, hardness of heart, and how strong a situation Jesus is suggesting it is. It's a severe accusation. In Jeremiah 4:4, this is translated as sclerocardia in the Septuagint. Jeremiah 4:4. He says, circumcise yourselves to the Lord, take away the foreskins of your heart, you men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my fury come forth like fire and burn that none quench it because of the evil of your doings. Them saying the foreskins of their heart, their hard-heartedness. They translated that as sclerocardia. In Mark, which is more that period, Mark chapter 16, Jesus appears after his resurrection, and it reads this way: afterward he appeared unto the 11 as they sat at meat, and upbraided them with their unbelief and sclerocardia, hardness of heart. Why? Because they believed not them which had seen him after he was risen. The situation Jesus is saying when it comes to hard-heartedness, the accusation is essentially almost damnable. Ezekiel, it is used as well. Ezekiel 3:4-7. The situation is Ezekiel is speaking, and it says, and he said unto me, Son of man, go get thee unto the house of Israel, and speak with my words unto them. For thou art not sent to a people of a strange speech, of a hard language, but to the house of Israel. You're not going after pagan or people that don't understand you. You're being sent to Israel. Not to many people of a strange speech, of a hard language, whose words thou canst not understand. Surely had I sent thee to them, they would have hearkened unto thee. But the house of Israel will not hearken unto thee, for they will not hearken unto me. For all the house of Israel are impudent and hard-hearted. That is being translated as sclerocardia. It's a damnable situation, nearly, not necessarily literally damnable. But it's a severe accusation. When Jesus says, because sclerocardia, because of the hardness of your hearts, because you are essentially acting worse than pagans, worse than non-Jews when it comes to what you believe and what you teach, or the faith that you will display, because you're that hard-hearted. Moses permitted, not commanded it. Okay. So Jesus is correcting some of those things. And in verse 9, he continues, look, Jesus says this. Moses, because of the, verse 8 in Matthew chapter 19, we're almost finished. Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. I say unto you, whoever shall put her away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marries her which is put away doth commit adultery. Okay. In verse 6, he says something critical. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. Ladies and gentlemen, the state of Florida cannot write a law which can absolve you morally from adultery. We do not have the authority to write laws that say such and such is not a sin. If we are to put away our wives for any reason, if we are going to say the state of Florida recognizes no-fault divorce, hey, I got the state of Florida divorce certificate, so clearly I'm not committing adultery by now shacking up with this woman, you're still an adulterer. Morally before God, no man has a right to write a law which directly counters God's moral code. And Jesus said in the beginning, this was not so. Man, when he says, let not man put asunder, he is saying the state of Florida does not have the power to overwrite my moral law, that moral principle. Now, I'm not saying that that adultery or that divorce is the unforgivable sin. It is not. There is no such thing. Well, it can be committed. It's the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. That's the one. That's the only unforgivable sin. Okay. Some people watching this may hear that they know they're remarried. They may be able to look back at this and say, I know that my first marriage, my divorce was not legitimate. It wasn't for adultery. Okay. It was a no-fault divorce. I got remarried, etc., etc., etc. You can be right with God. God is a God of mercy. His blood shed for you can wipe away any sin. all sins, okay? It is not the unpardonable sin. There's also no such thing as a perpetual sin. That is to say, a sin that once turned from and repented of exists forever. Now, there may be consequences to choices you make, okay? If I got a 666 tattoo on my forehead, God will forgive me that rather foolish and I would say sinful act. But he's not going to magically cause it to disappear. There's still going to be consequences to bad decisions, ladies and gentlemen. If you drink 6/5 of whiskey a day for 30 years and find yourself with cirrhosis of the liver, repentance is not going to necessarily magically cause cirrhosis to go away. Okay, you may have to pay the price for your lack, but that's not God's punishment necessarily. It's the natural results of foolish decisions, okay? But God is not going to condemn or refuse to forgive you. So look, if you're looking at this and you're saying, well, this guy just said fornication, adultery is the only biblical reasons or grounds for divorce. I do believe that is what the Bible teaches. Adultery and adultery alone is the only grounds for divorce that are permissible, not commanded, permissible. Ideally, it would be reconciliation and forgiveness, but God does forgive all sin, all right? And two wrongs will not make right. When Jesus said, he that marries her, in verse 9, whoso shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, he's committing adultery. Whoso marries her, which is put away, does commit adultery. All he's doing is following the logic. He's not saying anything new, okay? It's actually really not hard to really comprehend. He's just following that logic to its logical conclusion. He's saying, look, man doesn't have the authority to overrule God's laws. Moses did not have the authority. Your heretical reading of Deuteronomy chapter 24 does not alter God's laws, okay? You're still committing adultery, whether you lie to yourself about what is being taught or not. You're still committing adultery morally, whether the state of Florida claims it can absolve you or not. If you are in a same-sex relationship, the state of Florida cannot all of a sudden claim, don't worry, it's morally acceptable because you got a certificate from us. It's a sin. It is not a sin that God cannot and will not forgive you of. But Jesus is just carrying the logic to its logical conclusion. He's saying, therefore, obviously, unless there was adultery, then to leave and divorce, or to divorce for illegitimate reasons and to marry another is essentially to commit adultery, okay? So that's what's being done there, okay? So that's kind of Matthew, that passage in Matthew chapter 19, and what I believe is that the socio-historical context. Are there any questions so far or right now about anything specific there, or crude, snide remarks? No questions. Okay. All right. Next.